After a couple of videos dealing with more universal or at least pan-European subjects, I wanted to come closer to home with the next one, to my beloved region of Central and Eastern Europe. From now on, I will use just Eastern Europe, because it is annoying to repeat Central and Eastern all the time, and also because, even though we, Central Europeans, are salty about it, the vast majority of people in the rest of the world see us as Eastern Europe, whether we like it or not. That is a fact, whether you speak to a Western person or an Asian person. So, I won't get into the convoluted delicacies of persuading people about the legitimacy of our neck of the woods being Central Europe, and I will go with Eastern Europe. I will also define the region as the belt of countries from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Adriatic, Mediterranean and Black Seas in the south, demarcated by Italy, Austria and Germany in the west, and by Russia in the east. I won't include Russia, even though it, of course, lies in Eastern Europe. Still, it is fundamentally different, since it is a large imperial power, and Eastern European history was primarily defined by being a hodgepodge of mostly smaller nations trying to survive between the three imperial giants of Germany, Russia and Turkey. Some of the nations in the region are relatively numerous, for example Poles or Ukrainians, but nevertheless, they are not comparable to the bigger predators to their east and west. I will also include Greece, which is usually not included. That is because Greece was able to escape the region and hide within the more positively perceived Southern European brand. But its history, apart from the Cold War period, demographic profile, level of economic development and likely even its future, puts it far closer to other Eastern European nations than to Italy or Spain. Eastern Europe, at least the definition I am using, is also the most heterogeneous region of Europe. It includes historically Orthodox, Catholic, Muslim and Protestant countries. Countries belonging to Western, Orthodox and Muslim civilizations. Countries using 5 different alphabets and economic development levels ranging from fully developed countries to very poor ones. There also is a high level of variety among the political regimes in the region, since you have Western-style liberal democracies, full-fledged dictatorships, and various kinds of semi-authoritarian regimes and unstable democracies in between the two. Some countries are members of the EU and NATO, some are not. All this diversity might beg the question if it even makes sense to lump this area into one region. While that is a legitimate question, some characteristics connect the region. From the historical perspective, the essential feature is that this part of the world never really exercised much influence onto its surroundings in modern history, but, in opposition to that, mainly was the victim of foreign interference and imperialism. And I do not mean this in some morally condescending way to claim that the nations in the region were somehow morally superior, which is not the case. Of course, there was a fair share of bloody wars and atrocities between the countries in the area, but it is a historical fact that during the last couple of centuries, several Germanic powers, like Prussia, Austria and Germany itself, various incarnations of the Russian Empire and the Turks dominated the region to such an extent that for parts of the 19th century, none of the nations that inhabit the area had their nation state. This development led to a specific anti-imperialistic and survivalist mentality, which I examined in my first video on this channel. The other common characteristic is the fact that the region went through something of a year zero moment around 1990, when communism and the Soviet Empire imploded in Eastern Europe, and the countries in the area tried to find their spot in the world of globalized capitalism that reached its heyday in the last 30 years. Now, it is fair to acknowledge that there are no actual years zero in history. There is continuity between the communist regimes of the People's Republics and their successor states. The people, who are the substance of a state, remained the same. This historical continuity was also observable in the differences between the various Soviet satellites, which remained very diverse even after decades of powerful unifying external forces. These included both the levels of economic development and authoritarian despotism applied, the difference in the living standards of ordinary people, as well as the ruling style of the regime between communist Czechoslovakia and communist Romania was likely more significant than it is today. Nevertheless, it still was a fresh start for this part of the world, and an exciting laboratory for the attempts of different societies to try out capitalism and democracy. An interesting point is that the successful transition of Central European countries to democracy and capitalism in the 1990s was often used as a blueprint for the attempts to export democracy to various cultures around the world, for example, to the Middle East. But if one really looks at the transition of different countries in the region towards democracy, only the historically most westernized Central European countries that were adherents of Western branches of Christianity were successful. Nations that were historically parts of the Habsburg Empire, like Czechia or Hungary, were strongly influenced by the Scandinavian countries in their history, like the Baltic states, or even have a significant democratic tradition of their own, like Poland and the parliamentary monarchy of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The process was much less straightforward or even straight up failed in countries with different historical roots, stemming from the adherence to Orthodox Christianity and being influenced more significantly by the Byzantine, Ottoman, and Russian empires. Thus, one must conclude that the region is more of a blueprint of how transition to democracy is impossible in most of the world. If countries in Eastern Europe struggle with it, how could you expect Arab Muslim nations in the Middle East to succeed? What is also interesting is that when the last 30 years of the region's development, and at this point I am talking about the countries that managed to integrate into the Western political and economic structures, are being discussed, you can often hear two completely contradictory evaluations. I will call the first the neoliberal narrative, for lack of a better word. The neoliberal narrative, which economic liberals most often propose, basically sees the development in the region as a huge success. The countries managed to transition from a centrally planned economy to free market capitalism with relative ease and become massive recipients of foreign investment. As a result, GDP per capita often multiplied and living standards rose significantly. The other narrative, I will call it the neocolonial narrative, is most often proposed by leftist economists. It says that the countries just went from being the periphery of the communist empire to being the periphery of the European economy, selling out their national assets and also their populations to work for foreign, mostly German, corporations for wages many times lower than Western Europeans. It also sucks out the working age populations in the form of immigration to wealthier parts of Europe, contributing to the area's catastrophic demographic decline. Now, the reason for the widespread circulation of such contradictory views is that they are both correct. On the one hand, the economic rise of Eastern Europe is a fact that can hardly be denied. That is objectively quantifiable by statistical data and confirmed by lived experience. Many countries in the region have been among the fastest growing economies in the world during the last 30 years. Anyone who has been to Poland during the 1980s and who visits Poland today will tell you that there has been a change of a gargantuan proportions that is observable in comparison of Poland and Slovakia, countries that integrated into Western economic and political structures, with Ukraine, a country that did not. Ukraine had higher GDP per capita than Slovakia and Poland in 1990. But Poland and Slovakia had a 3 or 4 times higher GDP per capita in 2021, before the war started. Ordinary Czech people in the early 1990s really could not go over the border to Austria or Germany and have lunch in a restaurant, because it would cost something like a quarter of their monthly salary. Today, 650,000 Czechs go skiing in the Alps every year. The stories about Czech tourists equipped with homemade řízky and rohlíky s paštikou to save money on their foreign trips were a laughing matter in the 1990s, but are relatively rare now. In 1980s socialist Romania, there were food shortages and daily power cuts in Bucharest, the capital city. In 2019, Bucuresti Ilfov County was in the 14th place among EU NUTS regions in the GDP per capita in purchasing power parity metric, above cities like Stuttgart or Vienna. Now, we can successfully doubt if this metric is adequately calibrated, since those are much wealthier cities in any other way of looking at it. Still, it is a massive improvement from the food shortages and power cuts. Like Poland, people who have seen Romania during the communist period and today will tell you that the difference is staggering. In the GDP per capita in purchasing power parity, the Visegrad and Baltic countries are reaching levels of southern European countries like Spain or Italy, with Slovenia and the Czech Republic being ahead of Japan and on par with New Zealand. However, In the nominal GDP per capita, the difference is much more significant. And while the GDP per capita in purchasing power parity, Poland is on the 2/3 of the German level, in the nominal GDP per capita, so GDP per capita that does not consider the cost of living in the countries, Poland is only on 40% of the German level. I do not think there is a region in the world where the difference between the nominal GDP and GDP in purchasing power parity is so significant as in Eastern Europe, and I do not know why that is the case. Maybe someone who understands economics better can enlighten me in the comments. But on the other hand, one cannot deny that Eastern Europe stays on the periphery of global capitalism. The economic growth of the last 30 years was based mainly on the inflow of foreign capital and investment. This dependency on foreign capital makes people often say a colonial-like relationship exists between Eastern and Western Europe, particularly Germany. There is a persisting problem of a lack of significant domestic capital and homegrown international corporations that would generate it. Large parts of the economy, like banks and retail, are foreign-owned, leading to substantial capital outflows from the domestic markets abroad. While there is a low unemployment in the region, many jobs are relatively low-skilled manufacturing jobs, with lower proportion of high-skilled, high-value-added jobs in research and development. Industrial companies in the region are often subcontractors for Western companies and are making components with much lower profit margins than the final products assembled in the West. This situation leads to wages that are still 2 to 4 times lower in comparison with Western Europe, depending on the countries compared. The economic growth of the last 30 years was also very unevenly distributed within the countries, with large cities undergoing massive transformations and being close to the West in their living standards. But the peripheral regions with smaller towns and villages are often decaying and depopulating. The depopulation is also one of the region's most significant problems, because the combination of geographic and cultural proximity to much more affluent Western Europe makes it very easy for young people from Eastern Europe to emigrate to the West, which was happening massively mainly in the 1990s and 2000s. In combination with sub-replacement fertility rates, the region is one of the fastest depopulating parts of the world. So where is the truth? Is the area an economic success and living example of the superiority of capitalism, or a neo-colony of foreign capital, where people are working for subpar wages and the best and brightest are leaving for higher Western wages? I lean towards the former, and I will explain why. The difference between the two narratives is that they grow from different bases. The neoliberal one compares what is now with what was before, and comes to the inevitable conclusion that even if things are far from perfect, and there are many negative externalities, the current state of things is much better than the communist past. And if compared with the genuinely unsuccessful transformation in a country like Ukraine, things went really well. On the other hand, the neo-colonial narrative compares Eastern Europe with Western Europe and concludes that the difference in living standards is still significant and unlikely to converge completely. Thus, in a typically leftist manner, viewing the world through the prism of inequality and, ideally, oppression, the process failed and proved the fallacy of liberal capitalism. But this view is profoundly unhistorical and utopian. Eastern Europe was always poorer than Western Europe. The reasons are deep and date to the times of the Roman Empire, and their roots lie in geography, psychology, culture, family systems, and religion. It is a topic that would require its own video, which I will likely make in the future. But to think that they would be erased in 30 years is naive. Some parts of Eastern Europe, like the Czech Republic, were occasionally on par with Western Europe throughout history, and are closer to it in many ways than other countries in the region. Still, the gap is nothing new, and won't go away anytime soon. There also isn't any country you can point at and say that is how it should have been done. Today's wealth of the countries in the region mostly correlates with their wealth in the past, pointing to the influence of deep historical forces. Theories about how it should have been done instead are just that. Theories. Without foreign capital inflow and Western management supervision, most state-owned corporations privatized to foreign companies would not become highly competitive homegrown champions, but would go bankrupt instead. The situation would be much worse, resembling contemporary Ukraine more than contemporary Poland. There was not enough social or economic capital and know-how in the system. No one knew how to run a huge business in a market environment, The technological processes were mainly outdated and uncompetitive, and the system incentivized corruption. You can nationalize the whole economy with one decree, but to privatize it back is an entirely different discipline. The transformation in those parts of the region that later managed to integrate with the EU was thus successful if we look at it realistically.